Sean Diddy Combs has been arrested in a Manhattan hotel this evening after a grand jury indicted the music mogul.
Washington Post, just one question, did he or didn't he?
What are they now trying to do with these witnesses in order to prove the sex trafficking and racketeering?
Welcome to a special edition of the 25th Hour, the trial of Sean P. Diddy Combs, with your hosts, Bianca Forde and Alyse Adamson.
Welcome to another episode of the 25th Hour podcast. I'm Alyse.
I'm Bianca.
And of course, we're here breaking down the latest in the Sean P. Diddy Combs trial. And this week, we have finally come to a conclusion, or at least now the case will be getting into the hands of the jurors, and 12 men and women will be making the ultimate decision as to whether or not the government has proved their case against Sean P. Diddy Combs. Closing arguments were last Friday, and as of this recording, the judge has instructed the jury, and they are close to beginning their deliberations. So, of course, the question is, will Diddy be found guilty? And I am going to kick it to Bianca, putting her on the hot seat and saying, my goodness, we are here. What do you think is going to happen? And this poor jury, right?
Whoa, it has been a long 6/7 weeks. Last week we talked about negotiating jury instructions, and I talked to you about how excited I was about that. But I gotta say, I also love closings, and they're almost, they're so connected that it's hard to parse them out. But I will say that this is the part where the parties are responsible for putting the puzzle pieces together, right? We talked about on a prior episode the fact that the evidence doesn't always come in consequential order, and this is the prosecution and the defense's job to a degree, but primarily the prosecution's job to say, because it's their burden, how does it all fit together? And in a case like this that is so complicated, how do you make the complex simple? I think a lot of people may just assume that when you're preparing for a closing argument, you're writing your argument as trial is coming to an end, or even after all of the evidence is in, but that is not true, especially in a case like this. I would imagine that the prosecutors in this case, they were thinking about their closing as they were indicting this case, and definitely as they were preparing for trial. They might have even sketched their closing with the ability to make alterations based on how the evidence came in. And, I will say that my take on this might be a little partial to the prosecution, in part because I was able to read the prosecution's complete closing argument, and I had to take what the defense may or may not have said from just media articles. But when I say the prosecution did a phenomenal job at putting the pieces together, at figuring, there was even a reference with everything that I think a lot of folks have struggled with, which is this is a very novel use of the RICO statute. And the lead prosecutor on the lead closing argument basically said, look, we know this is usually connected to kingpins, right? And you might know that the RICO statute is historically associated with mafia organizations. But here is how Sean Diddy Combs operated as a kingpin in this context. And I think they did a marvelous job putting the pieces together in that respect. And we can talk a little bit more about specifics later. But what did you think, Alyse?
No, I agree with you. I'm also extremely biased when it comes to the prosecution. I've been a defense attorney for almost 4 years now, but anybody who was a former prosecutor will tell you that it's one of the greatest jobs, if not the greatest you'll ever have. And we're trained to think a certain way. And I agree with you. I think, or we said last time that this is going to have to be the best closing ever. And I think it really was a phenomenal closing. Made it easy for the jury to understand their theory of the case. They had great themes. One of the themes I loved is he wouldn't take no for an answer.
Yeah.
Because what I've been saying throughout this trial is the problem is the prosecution has a very technically complicated case. The defense has a very simple defense narrative. And so you're dealing with really complicated stuff for the party that has the burden. And then you have very simple concepts to understand from the folks that don't have the burden at all, right? They just get to sow doubt. That was always my concern. But I think that closing helped, and this is what you just said, to your point, made the complicated, brought it down to more simple to understand points or easily digestible points. And I think that they hit all the key issues. And you and I have both said that the prosecution had technically proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt. And we know the judge agreed, because when the defense moved to have the case tossed out, we call that motion for judgment of acquittal, after the government's evidence is in. It's basically when they say, judge, there wasn't enough evidence here for any juror to find beyond a reasonable doubt. The judge disagreed and said, no, we think they presented enough evidence, right? So it's just, how do we explain that evidence to a jury in the way that they can understand so it overcomes any doubt? I think we have a possibility of that here. But what I do understand from the reporting, Mark Agnifilo, also a very good attorney, phenomenal defense attorney. He knows what he is doing. The strategy was good. He's the lead defense attorney on this case. Apparently, he was very sarcastic in his closing. Yeah. The vibe was, are you kidding me? Like, he made this comment about Astroglide. Like, thank God the government came in and swooped up all this Astroglide. We're safe. And he was actually admonished by the judge about some of his behavior. He made an improper reference to that the prosecution had targeted Sean Combs. And this is, of course, is what we've heard, especially in the black community. They're targeting a black man. And I think Agnifilo knew that, yeah, maybe he'll get a curative instruction, meaning the judge is going to tell the jury, you can't assume that the government targeted or that was improper. But it doesn't matter. We always say it's like the toothpaste. Once you can't get it back in the tube. And so I think he knew what he was doing. I think he was riffing off of public sentiment, which is this is an overcharge. What are you doing? That sarcasm, that righteous indignation. And I think some of that may resonate with a jury. So this is more, to me, like a case of the law, right? The elements being met, and then feels. But as we have found in our practice, sometimes jurors get confused by feels. And it's hard to really explain to them the difference, that is not reasonable doubt. And the government did a great job explaining what reasonable doubt is and not. And the judge instructed them accordingly. But jurors are people, man. And this is hard, you know? Yeah. And I think the defense team is good.
Yeah. I mean, to your point about feels, right? Like, there's this concept of jury nullification, where even if the jury believes that the elements of a case have been met by the prosecution, they may nonetheless acquit if they believe that it's an overreach, an overcharge, or if the law itself is being applied inequitably, right? So to your point, if the defense attorney was able to make comments that resonated in that way, right? I read something where there was a reference to Sean Combs just being a black entrepreneur, right? He was he was, using the hammer appropriately on some of those nails that might strike a chord with the jury. But I will say, I don't know if you've gotten some questions about some of this stuff offline, Alyse, but it's been coming up in conversations that I've had, and even like pings on Instagram and things like that. But someone was like, how was the prosecution able to still talk about the arson and the kidnappings when they withdrew those as theories of the RICO? And I just want to say that
it's bad. It was bad reporting. Yeah, go ahead. It was bad. People didn't explain it properly.
Exactly. Like, I've seen news articles that said the prosecution dropped the charges. That's just not right. What they basically said is, these are not predicates, jury, that you have to align on with respect to the RICO charge. So they, I imagine, will not appear under the RICO charge on the verdict sheet. But those allegations are still very relevant to other aspects of the government's case. For instance, the alleged kidnapping where Cassie was kept in a hotel for days on end while her face healed because Sean Combs allegedly stomped on her face, right? The prosecution has charged that as kidnapping, or not charged it as kidnapping, but has talked about it in the sense of it being
it's a predicate
part of coercion. Right?
Well, it's also a predicate offense. And I just want to put a finer point on this, because I went and did a deep dive because I was very confused. This is what happens. And this is not me knocking reporters. If you're not a lawyer, again, this stuff is so technical that it is hard to understand. And we are not in the courtroom, so we don't hear the conversation. What I understand happened, Bianca, is in the indictment, and this is the charging document, all of those predicate offenses, some of them, they charge the completed crime, like a completed kidnapping, and they also reference the criminal code for the attempted crime as well, which we know, because as former prosecutors, we would charge what was known as like that completed crime, the top count. We'd also charge what's known as a lesser included offense, which is the attempt. All the government did was pare back the lesser included offenses. They removed from consideration attempted kidnapping and attempted arson. And somehow that led to reporting that the government dropped kidnapping and arson charges. He was never charged with kidnapping or arson. Kidnapping and arson were two of the 10 predicate offenses, and the government still closed on kidnapping and arson, and the jury may still consider kidnapping and arson. It was the attempted, we call those inchoate offenses, that were dropped and streamlined, because I'm sure the problem is trying to explain to a jury, you may find this for kidnapping, but you may also find if it was not completed. That is too complicated, and it's unnecessary. They got a smorgasbord of predicate acts for you to choose. So why confuse them with some incompleted offenses when you have the complete offenses you could charge and then everything else? So I think that's what happened. And I think our confusion as lawyers, because I was confused, I skimmed the letter, I was confused. So I think that confusion is the reason that the government decided to drop it. That's my understanding of what happened.
So is it your understanding then that the kidnapping and the arson and the aiding and abetting are still going to appear as RICO predicates on the verdict sheet?
Aiding and abetting is not going to be on the verdict sheet because they just have the regular sex trafficking, but kidnapping and arson will. Kidnapping, they closed on kidnapping and arson. It was the attempted kidnapping and it was the attempted arson.
Got it. All right. Well, that's
my understanding, though. But again, it's confusing.
Yeah.
That is my understanding. If you look, I believe that they streamlined off the attempt kidnapping, the attempt arson. So it's just going to be.
I want to see the verdict sheet. I really
Me
do.
too.
Even after reading the closing, I left with the understanding that the kidnapping or the alleged kidnapping of Capricorn Clark, even to take her to Cuddy's home, was relevant to the forced labor, right, for Capricorn Clark, and then also relevant to the extremes that Sean Combs would go to control Cassie. So I'd love to see the verdict sheet to see if kidnapping and
you
arson
could be
are still there. Yeah.
You could also be right. I'm just when they said attempted and then I read the closing, but again, I think we need to see the verdict form and we need to see the final jury instructions. It is confusing, but again, this conversation between two people who have been lawyers for a long time, I'm not going to say how long because I don't need to tell people, my age, but we've been lawyers for a long time. We're confused. This to me is just highlights the problem with this case. Like, it is so complicated. Imagine a juror. This is why the closings matter, and this is also why the jury instructions matter. Like, how the judge is explaining all of this to the jury. So they go back and they're like, well, I thought it was this. Like, they're going to have instructions in front of them. They're going to have like the written word that the judge is going to read to them. But even that, it can still be confusing, right?
Yeah. And, I don't know if you read anything about this, but in terms of Mr. how do you say his name? Agnifilo. In terms of his closing argument, I did hear a few news reports about some inappropriate comments that teetered the line of misogyny in terms of how he painted Cassie. And there were also a couple of things that kind of seemed a little incredible to me. There was a suggestion, I believe, during his closing argument that with respect to the transport to engage in prostitution, that Sean Combs was paying for time, right? Not sex. I mean,
he had to say. I mean, I think the government has the defense kind of dead to rights on the Mann Act. But what was he going to say? He wasn't going to go up and like concede the point. He's trying to sow doubt. He's trying to sow doubt. His stronger arguments were clearly to the sex trafficking and the RICO, but they had to say something because if there is any place, any gap that the government has missed, you have to exploit it. So I just think that it did seem incredible, but what else was he going to say, right? Like he's very skilled. And I just want to say a fun fact about Mr. Agnifilo, his wife, who I had the pleasure of meeting on CNN. She has her own podcast. It's just very legally detailed focused. She is representing the Mangione boy, the guy, I just can't, Luigi Mangione, that's his name. I guess he's an adult who killed the United Healthcare guy. She's his defense attorney. She spent years as a Bronx DA. I think she was like a chief, very smart. That family. Can you imagine what that family's like? I mean, they're both highly skilled lawyers. So that's why it might sound incredible, but there's a reason that he did it. And if he had a juror who's just looking for a reason, like give me a reason to doubt, he gave it to him, right?
Yeah, I mean, but on the same token, there's that line where you'll have those jurors who are who could be offended, right? Like, you want me to not believe my lying eyes and use my common sense, but I hear you, right?
Totally agree.
It goes both ways. But there was one example that the prosecution used in terms of illustrating how Combs had groomed and molded Cassie, and there was an example of Cassie being in Capricorn Clark and Sean Combs being in a room together, and Sean Combs saying something to the effect of, "Let me show you something," and bringing Cassie into the room and basically saying, "Move that way, turn around, turn the other way, grab that, come over here, put that down," like that kind of thing, to demonstrate that he'd had this, she was very young at the time, 1.5 slash, twice his junior. And it really, hearing the prosecution sort of describe that was really powerful just by reading the transcript. I can only imagine like how it resonated with the jury. And it just sort of highlights the fact that when you have a trial that's taking place in federal court where you don't have TVs and you can't just like hear everything for yourself and really be a part of the trial as a member of the public, the transcript for me just was such a powerful example of what we were missing, right, throughout the pendency of this entire trial by relying on media. So
yeah, no, I wish we could have been in there every day, right? And I mean that's why reading jury, just a little inside baseball. Lawyers use jury consultants. There is an entire industry out there to help lawyers understand jurors, both how to ferret out potential biases when you're selecting that jury during that voir dire process, and then also what to look for so you know what is resonating with your jury. And then I remember when I was trying cases, I would be in the moment, so I couldn't really do it, but I would have colleagues look at the jury and I would say, did anything seem like it was hitting? Did anything seem like I was missing? How did they look after closing? And I mean, that's just, again, it's reading the tea leaves. That's the best that you can do. But I think to your point, like we would have had a better sense of how this was falling if we had been able to see it. But reading the transcript, I think the government knocked it out of the park. They did everything they possibly could with this case. After they brought it. And I think the closing was successful. Just a small note, I did hear that the prosecutor was reading a bunch of her closing and Mr. Agnifilo was up really performing to the jury. But I think that's also very common when you're the government. You have to hit your elements. You have to make sure you get everything out. The defense really is more performative at the end of the day. It's not their burden. And I remember being really mad about that as a prosecutor. I'm like, they get to go have all this fun saying all these things, but we were constrained with the facts and the law. There's two very different roles in that courtroom. So that's always a challenge as well. But now the arguments are in and the evidence is in and the judge has instructed the jury, as we said, that means telling them about the facts and the law. And the jury's going to go back and retire to their deliberations.
Look, there's a lot for the jury to cover. They have a commitment. They have a civic duty. We're going to trust in them to do the right thing and do it the way that the judge has instructed them to do it or is instructing them to do it. And to the extent there's anything else to break down on this, Alyse, we're going to be here for the people.
Girl,
right?
We're going to show up after this verdict. So we're going to put a pin in this and then we're going to be back. Or if we're getting a lot of notes, we'll come back and we'll talk about it if the jury seems like they're confused. So make sure you stay tuned. Go ahead and hit like, subscribe, so you can get those updates as soon as we have them for you. And thank you so much for joining. We're going to see you hopefully soon because I'm anxious. I got to know how this turns out.
For real.